Go.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am Mitchell Kaplan, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of the Miami Book Fair and everyone at Books and Books, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's virtual evening with Nicholas Griffin to discuss his new book, The
Mitchell.
Dangerous Days.
Mitchell.
Yeah.
There seems to be an issue with your sound.
There wasn't before.
I know. Can you close out of all tabs on your computer?
Yes. I apologize to everybody out there.
And if you better, okay.
Is that better?
But if you have headphones, I would grab them.
Okay. I will get my headphones. Christina?
Yes?
Can you hear me better?
Much.
Okay.
Go for it.
Thank you, everyone out there, for understanding. I'm Mitchell Kaplan, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight on behalf of the Miami Book Fair and all of us at Books and Books. I'm really delighted to welcome you to tonight's virtual evening with Nicholas Griffin to discuss his new book, The Year of Dangerous Days: Riots, Refugees, and Cocaine in Miami 1980. This is the book. It's a gorgeous book published by Simon Schuster. It's a portrait of Miami against the trifold complicating factors of mass immigration, drug crisis, and police brutality. The Year of Dangerous Days chronicles Miami in the tumultuous moment of 1980 to serve as both origin story and as witness to the present day. In a remarkable New York Times review this very day, the Times hailed The Year of Dangerous Days as utterly absorbing, and it remarked, "It's impossible to read Griffin's timely and searing account without thinking about its implications for our current moment." Nicholas is a journalist and author of 4 novels and 3 works of nonfiction. His writings appeared in the Times of London, the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and many, many other journals and magazines. And I remember when we presented him for the very first time for his remarkable book, Ping Pong Diplomacy. That book was shortlisted for the Penn ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. That event was a physical event. And that's why I'm so pleased to be working with Nicholas once again, and that we can launch this event with The Year of Dangerous Days. I've learned that I have to hold the book up a lot, and I like doing it, so that we can launch this event at our virtual bookshop. In conversation with Nick tonight, it's really my pleasure to bring on a friend of 40 years. I think he might have been the second person through the door of our bookshop when we opened in 1982. I like to call him Miami's very own Walter Cronkite. You know him today as Local 10's senior reporter on politics and government, and the writer of a semi-monthly column on politics for the Miami Herald. Michael began his career in broadcast journalism in 1966 as a graduate student in Columbia, Missouri. And then he moved to Washington, D.C. in 1970, where he worked for the National Observer and Time, Inc. The Miami Herald was smart, and they lured him down here in 1977, where he covered much of what Nick writes about. So it'll be really interesting to see this dynamic. In 1981, he moved from print into broadcast, and he joined WTVJ in Miami, and he always has reported on a broad array of stories, but with a heavy focus on government and politics. He also became the weekend co-anchor in 1986. Michael has won 2 Emmys. And I also have to say on a personal note that Michael happens to be one of the great readers that we have here in Miami. I remember the last time at the bookshop when he did an introduction, it was for the writer Richard Ford. So Michael's taste is very, very broad, and he's got a lot to offer. And for me personally as well, it's really wonderful to see the kind of the kind of broad range of journalists that we have here in Miami, from someone with the experience of Michael to someone who works on that experience and interprets it in a brilliant way, such as Nick. So to have them both is a real treat for me. I want all of you out there to know that you can ask questions by looking at the Ask Question button, which is right down here. And also, if you'd like to buy a book at any time during the event, there's a place below the picture as well to be able to do that. Every purchase that you make helps us at Books and Books stay alive. And again, I want to thank everybody for the remarkable support that our community has shown us and has shown Books and Books. So without further ado, let me bring on Nicholas and Michael. And if everything goes right, they should magically appear. There's Nicholas. Welcome, Nick.
Hey, Mitchell, how are you?
And there's Michael.
And Nicholas, great to see you. Well, good evening, everybody. What a privilege to be invited by Mitchell and Christina Nosti to have this conversation about a really extraordinary book. Nick, I tore through it. I think in about 2 days, I read it. And part of the reason is I reported on this stuff in 1980, but you know, as a Miami Herald columnist, reporter, but you have taught me so much, and you also have a much wider ambit, and you were talking in a kind of a larger metaphor about what Miami used to be and what it became thanks to or because of 1980. Let me just elaborate on one thing that Mitchell said. What a wonderful, propitious time to have this conversation. In the New York Times today, Gilbert King, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning Devil in the Grove, hailed this book, and he said, there is never a dull moment in the year of dangerous days, and Griffin adroitly captures the image and the depravity of South Florida at the time. So, Nick, congratulations on that. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, Michael.
All right, so let's begin with a very obvious question. Journalism, as you know, is about a lot of obvious things, at least to start off with. Why Miami in 1980? What was it that captured your imagination?
Well, when I moved down here, I always start with thinking of really big questions. Some questions are so big and obvious that people stop asking them of themselves. And the big question I asked was, how come I'm living in a Latin American city inside American borders? Every other immigrant group in the country seems to get absorbed, and the city absorbs the immigrant group. But in Miami, it happened the other way around, that Miami stayed Latin through Latin immigration and still feels very Latin today. So of course I then thought, well, I wonder how that happened. You know, of course I knew about Cubans arriving in 1960, but you know, why hadn't they been absorbed by 1980? Why were they still so distinct? The city could change so quickly. And every bit of research I did seemed to lead me back to 1980. And I'd heard a lot of stories about 1980. You know, I knew about Mariel boat lift. I knew a little bit about the McDuffie riots. And of course, we all know about Miami's struggles with cocaine. But what I'd never realized was that these crises just hit one on top of another. And in some ways, you can really narrow those crises down to this extraordinary 6-week period. So you know what? Of course, you get catalysts during crisis, and this was a triple catalyst.
Yeah. So April, May of 1980, there was this kind of cavalcade of incredible events. So you have written a story that binds them together: the Mariel boat lift, the incredible rise of the cocaine industry, the violence of the Colombians who came and ran it, the murders, and then, of course, the Arthur McDuffie murder in 1979 and the trial in 1980. Let maybe kind of begin there if I can. because we are going through a Black Lives Matter moment in this country, you know, since the murder of George Floyd. And in some ways, I look at the McDuffie murder, and that was the first, or at least in my view, one of the first kind of Black Lives Matter moments that happened in Miami in that era.
Yeah, I think that there's an awful lot in common in many unfortunate ways with George Floyd. I think the big difference, of course, is that Floyd's incident was caught on camera, and the whole problem with the McDuffie incident was that there were only 15 witnesses, and all 15 of them were police officers. And the McDuffie incident happens at 2 a.m. So you've really got this, you know, what do you do if you're a prosecutor and you're going to take that trial to court? There's only one way to do it, and that's to turn some police officers as witnesses for the state. And I think that's part of the reason you get this extraordinary trial. And of course, that has an awful lot to do with the outcome of that trial, which ends up setting Miami on fire.
Now, the story was broken by the incredible Edna Buchanan of the Miami Herald, famous for purple prose and getting the details of a crime scene, a murder scene like nobody else. Won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting. Tell us how Edna got the tip and then what she did with it.
Well, I think it's very Edna that when the phone goes off at her desk in the Miami Herald and she picks it up and she's given this tip by a source who remains unnamed, when she then puts that phone down, picks up another phone and calls the hospital to see if this could be true, that there had been this incident where a man had been carried in at 2 a.m. after a supposed traffic accident. You know, she was only minutes after the man had died, and then when she places the next phone call, it's to the chief of detectives. She's so far ahead of the game, the chief of detectives has never even heard McDuffie's name. And that, of course, rings every alarm bell in Edna Buchanan's head and sets her off on this incredible trail of extraordinary work of journalism to figure out quickly and publish that this wasn't a traffic accident, this was murder.
Right. And it set off an incredible journey by Captain Marshall Frank, who I think, somewhat surprisingly, I've known a lot of hard-boiled cops. They do not open themselves up to this kind of meditation or self-reflection. I mean, he was an intellectual, as you point out. You know, he played the violin and the orchestra in Broward County.
Yeah.
Tell us about Marshall Frank. How did you get him to speak with you so candidly?
Well, you know, Marshall Frank, he's a good man, and he's open about his life to the extent where he's written a very revealing autobiography anyway. So I sort of hoped he would speak to me, and he did sit down, and we had an awful lot to talk about. But it's an extraordinary life. It's a great book to read if anyone wants to have a real taste of Miami in the 60s and 70s. It's called From Violins to Violence. But he started off life in New York. He was the son of a showgirl and a mobster. And of course, when things get a little hot in New York, they move the family down to Miami. And of course, his mother then remarries a second mobster. And with the help of the mobster, Marshall has this desire to enter the police force. And with a nudge here and a wink there, he not only gets in, but he rises very quickly into the homicide division, which is sort of the holy grail of any police force, where most policemen aspire to be. And he has this extraordinarily successful term as a homicide detective. He does very, very well. And then, talk about being thrown a hot potato, in 79, halfway through 79, he gets handed the homicide department to run. And that is literally, I think, 2 weeks before he's given that job. No, 2 weeks after he's given that job, you have the Dadeland Murders, which is the first big blast in the cocaine wars. So you know, it's the greatest hot potato of all hot potatoes.
Yeah, I recall I lived down near Dadeland back in 1979 when those Colombian drug dealers had the shootout in the liquor store and then just came out into the parking lot and still started, were spraying bullets all over the place. I mean, it was a frightening moment, and it was only the beginning. So how did Marshal Frank and his detectives finally flip some of the cops to agree to? They gave them immunity, and they agreed to testify. But their testimony, as you point out, in fact, was basically pretty flawed and inconsistent.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, Buchanan's done so much good work in the newspapers, and then Frank does a lot of good work with the investigation, and I think they can read the writing. The whole state is rolling the way of these cops, and you know, if they all knew that if they didn't get ahead of this, then that spotlight could land on them, and they'd all be up for indictment. So the first one to crack was actually the son of a high-ranking police officer who probably had something to do with his son's decision, and he's marched in, and once he begins to talk, then you get a second one, and then just before the trial, a third one joins. And you know, this is, how many do you need? Should you have gone for one? Should you have stayed with one? Should you have gone for two? Because of course, your biggest problem is that if you then give immunity to someone who turns out to have done part of the beating themselves. And that, of course, is one of the great questions of this trial. Who was responsible for the murder of Arthur McDuffie?
Yeah. One of the side notes, I mean, important to me as a Herald reporter at the time, the reporter who covered it for the Herald was the singular, fabulous Eugene Miller, twice a Pulitzer Prize winner. And as you point out in the book, Gene played it kind of close to the vest. He did not sort of telegraph the guilt or innocence or a verdict. I mean, he, really did not go as far as, I mean, you point out that the reporter for the Miami Times eventually said, get ready for a bad verdict here.
Yeah, but the sad part is no one really read the Miami Times, and everyone read the Herald. You know, back in those days, the Herald could pull in easily 500,000 readers on a Sunday, and the Times certainly wasn't doing anything like that. So unfortunately, the Herald was still the number1 voice of the community, and for whatever reasons, Gene Miller kept his prose reasonably dry. He was, of course, a crusading journalist, and he'd built, those Pulitzers were built around racial injustice. So you would have thought he'd been the perfect person to cover it, but the result of the trial really lands with no warning for the community, and I think that's a big part of the problem. And the biggest part of the problem is, of course, it's the jury has handed the case on a Friday. Presumption was that such a hot case would take at least 3, 4, 5 days for a jury to sort through, and remarkably, the jury came back with a decision in 2 hours and 40 minutes. That meant it was Saturday. That means no one was at work, no one was at school, and everyone was sitting listening to their radios. And when that breaks, then the reaction is absolutely immediate. You have your first murder, I think, within an hour and a half, and it only gets worse for the next 2 days.
Yeah, I can still remember the smoke rising above Liberty City and the sound of gunfire and sirens, and I mean, and you describe in graphic detail how brutal some of these murders were. I mean, you talk about I think a Cuban butcher, who is in his van, and they attack the van, and the police have to pull the whole van away from the crime scene because they're firing at the van.
Yeah, it's a really miserable 48 hours for Miami, and the first 24 hours are young black men are hunting white citizens through the streets and killing them with everything from spears to pouring gasoline on them. And then day 2 is the reverse. White men go into black neighborhoods with guns and shoot down totally innocent black men and women. It's heartbreaking 48 hours. And of course, why does this happen? Because the police have lost hold of the city. It's a really unfortunate thing, but when these murders first start happening, they try and cordon off quite a large area of Liberty City and Overtown. But then, of course, when the first emergency calls come in, who's the closest cop? The closest cop's the guy at the perimeter. And if you're a cop, you're then torn. You're there to protect people. You know someone's about to be murdered 5 blocks away. What do? You drive over to try and save them. As soon as you leave your post, guess what happens? More cars with unsuspecting citizens drive straight through into the area. And that's what you got for a few hours at the beginning of the night that caused a lot of that early bloodshed.
Yeah. And you describe it vividly and very well. All right, well, let's kind of shift our focus if we can to, because we're going to leave time here. There are going to be many questions here from people who are with us virtually. Let's take a look here at the rise of the Colombian cocaine industry in Miami, which, and for what it's worth, I lived in Corals at the time, and on a kind of a quiet street off Lejeune Road, and late one night, early one morning, somebody had killed a guy, a Colombian, and they just dumped the body, right by the sidewalk. And it wasn't typical, but in a sense, no matter who you were or where you lived, I think people were touched by this violence that came with the cocaine.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes source for very black humor within the homicide department. No one wants to go near a television box or an oil barrel for the fear of finding yet another body. But it's a real uptick in violence. But the real truth of the matter is it's about the money, not the bloodshed to begin with. And I think the most shocking figure, you can look at the homicide figures that year and their remarkable uptick. But if you look at the financial figures that year, it's even more remarkable. If you think that the Federal Reserve in 1979 would look at the regions and you were expecting in 79-80 either a surplus or a deficit of approximately $100 million, and then suddenly in 79-80 you have South Florida running $7 billion surplus, then you know you have a big problem. And of course, there's so much money to be made that it attracts people willing to do pretty much anything. So think of this as well. Your starting salary as a policeman in Miami in the mid-70s was $10,000. $10,000 was what you could earn in 24 hours as a lookout, not a killer, not a money launderer or a main man. That was sort of chump change.
Yeah. One of the things, I'm sorry, I lost you for a second there. Nick, one of the stories, one of the profiles you tell so well in the book is of Isaac Catan, who I guess was the main, you described the main money launderer for the Colombians. And on each day he would go to a bank and deposit millions. How much money would he deposit on any given day?
I think he averaged $1 million a day. And it was all in between $5, $10, $20, $50 notes. And it was all in the duffel bags of his cars. And he drove I think it was a Chevy Nova. And he would always pull up in front of the bank. And the security guard would always carry the duffel bags in. And then the bank would bring in 5 extra people just to count the money in the basement. So, the banks could look you in the eye and tell you they knew nothing about the drug industry. But where exactly did they think that money was coming from? And of course, 1980, you have to remember, there were no anti-money laundering laws at all in 1980.
Right.
So banks could sort of get away for a while. And the amount of banks doing this once the government started having a close look was staggering. They nailed at least 26 banks that opening year. But, they were open for business. They had money to make. And for Catan, think of this. Catan launders roughly $300 to $350 million for a few years. Now he's making 6%. I mean, the number one CEO in America in 79-80 is making $1.6 million, and Catan's making multiples of that. No one's seen cash like this in the world, and it's all in Miami.
Yeah. Nick, at one point you describe how this conglomeration of federal law enforcement, FBI, DEA, and others who got together to form a task force and worked with the Miami Police Department and the Miami-Dade Police Department, or Metro as they called it then, how they were astounded. They had a sort of a criteria where if it was 10 million or something, they would look into it, and then they saw that they were way low in their estimation about how much money they were talking about.
That's right. At the beginning of the year when they started, they were told anyone laundering over $1 million we need to have a close look at. And about 8 weeks later, they said anyone laundering over $100 million, we need to have a look at. So no one was prepared for money of this size. What was sad about Operation Greenback, and it was an enormous success, don't get me wrong, but the agencies who were told to report for duty, half of them never showed up. So Operation Greenback is led and has those amazing early successes only thanks to the IRS and Customs. FBI loves to come in late, and they take a lot of credit towards the end of the year, as do some other agencies. And the DEA begin to help a lot at the end of the year, but they're late to the party as well. But they play an extraordinary role to the end because, of course, the DEA has better intelligence out of Colombia than anyone. But the heavy lifting at the beginning of the year was only done by 2 agencies. And I think, had you asked the DEA at the end of '79, what's your biggest problem for America, they would have looked you in the eye and told you it was heroin. Now, DEA Miami agents knew better than that, but that's where the money was going. And it's only thanks to Greenback that they start to understand that cocaine is going to be a much bigger problem.
Yeah. One of the other elements here that I found fascinating, although I had to take a Spanish course to be able to live and work in Miami as a reporter, but you point out that these Miami-Dade County police and, most of these police officers, there were not really good Spanish speakers, and they couldn't investigate. I mean, it was hard enough to try to break through the wall of silence of the Colombians, but there were just not enough people who could really speak the language.
Yeah, and that was a common problem across pretty much every business, including the Miami Herald at certain points. The irony, as far as the police went, was there were actually quite a lot of Spanish-speaking homicide detectives at the beginning of the year. But when that cocaine money floods Miami, the institutions are the first places to get corrupted. Banks go very early, and the homicide department goes very early. So what happens is all the Spanish-speaking homicide detectives are tapped into by people they're supposed to be investigating. In this case, there's one relatively low-level cocaine dealer, but he's already got so much money that he corrupts over a third of the homicide department. When the FBI investigate Marshall Frank's homicide department, they basically either transfer or throw into jail or fire an enormous amount of detectives. So that means during the year, when you have the highest ever spike of murders in American history, there are 3 detectives with more than 1 year of experience. So, try and solve 600 murders with that sort of experience. So, poor Marshall Frank, his numbers are slipping despite everything that he's doing. But, even Frank's not a native Spanish speaker.
Right. Well, and you also, you've talked to so many people for this book. One of them was Guillermo Martinez, who, was an excellent reporter for the Herald, editor later. When I was at the Herald, I think the only street reporter who was Cuban, the only one out of a newsroom of maybe 400 people, was Guillermo Martinez. I mean, that's completely changed. I mean, everybody at the Herald basically is bilingual and has been for years, but not then.
Yeah, and I think that the Herald gets several shocks that year. That's the first shock. Okay, how are we going to cover the Mariel boat lift? We'll send everyone who speaks Spanish. Who speaks Spanish? Guillermo Martinez. And of course, they then send them to Costa Rica to try and get the very first people who leave. And of course, the real action is then taking place back in Miami a day later. So the poor guy's going back and forth like a yo-yo. And then, but it's the same problem happens during the McDuffie riots, when the Herald looks around the newsroom and is trying to find people to go out into the riot. The brilliant idea is, of course, it's slightly safer for a black reporter than the white reporter. But they have Joe Oglesby, there's one guy on the city desk who has to go out. And it's a lot to ask, because as Joe Oglesby told me, you've got not one but 2 worries if you're a black reporter heading out into a riot. A, the police might look at you and not see a reporter, and B, the rioters might look at you and see a journalist. So isn't it even worse?
Yeah. Joe Oglesby, for what it's worth, and it's worth a lot to me, is very dear to me. He was a friend then, and he introduced me to my wife. So thank God, Joe Oglesby. Very, very grateful. Nick, let me tell you, I guess it was early May of 1980, I stood on the docks in Key West, and I watched these ships come in from Mariel. And when you see the families, nice looking people, children get off, and your heart kind of goes out to them for what they had been through, and you wish them well. And at the same time, then there would be this group of really bad looking guys, prison tattoos all over them. And you began to wonder, what has Castro done? Of course, what he did was allow, people who leave, who wanted to leave Cuba, but also emptied out his jails and also some mental institutions. I mean, it was fiendishly clever of him.
Yeah, and of course it's this game almost that he's having with Jimmy Carter during an election year, and it puts Carter in an awful lot of trouble very quickly. But of course, it's really not aimed at America. This is aimed at Miami, and it's aimed at Cuban Americans. And right. Of course, Castro was always hearing how Cuban Americans had started more businesses in 20 years than he had in Havana, just in one city instead of the whole country. Right. And now he's terribly embarrassed by the beginning of Mariel. The embassy in Havana is full of 10,000 people. He throws the door open to the embassy and says, anyone who wants to go can go, thinking no one's going to go in. And of course, the place fills up in under 24 hours. And then when people want to leave, it's 125,000 people who want to leave, not 10,000. Right. But when he includes the prison elements, that basically doubles Miami's criminal population overnight. So again, think back. You've got very few experienced homicide detectives left, and you've got very little housing left. So where did they decide to house everyone? In the cheapest property we have in Miami, which at the time was what's now the most expensive property in Miami, Ocean Drive and Miami Beach, which was populated by extremely elderly people, a lot of falling down hotels,
old Jews. Yeah, exactly. I do remember Jimmy Carter coming into the Miami Herald, I mean, after Mariel, to meet with the editorial board. And one of the proud moments for me was the executive editor of the Herald. His name is John McMullen, maybe the toughest journalist I ever knew, just really raked Jimmy Carter over the coals over his dithering with the policy about whether they could come, and then finally saying we open up our arms. But, then Carter did not come through, as you report, and really give Miami the help and support it needed to house, and clothe, and feed all these immigrants. That it was really the Cubans who were here who took charge of that, along with Maurice Ferré.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, Carter simply drops the ball. He changes his mind. I mean, one customs agent I spoke to said they used to joke that originally it was policy of the week, then they called it policy of the day, and then it became policy of the hour. They just didn't know what they were supposed to do. And of course, the city is entirely unprepared for this. The city of Miami has about 320,000 people in it. Now you've got 125,000 people landing on top of that. Where do you find the housing? Where do you find the schools? How do you feed people? Where are the jobs? And of course, 1917, 1980, economically, it's a basket case of a year. Again, you've got to put your finger towards Jimmy Carter. I mean, his own domestic policy advisor calls this the single worst last year of a presidency in history. But we were lucky, and I'll tell you why I think we were lucky, and that's because we had a small cadre of politicians who wanted to do the right thing and did do the right thing. And at the head of that,
Governor Bob Graham.
Bob Graham really tried hard. I think the county manager at the time was very involved, and of course, Maurice Ferré had personal links, and no one wanted Miami to be moving in the right direction more than Maurice Ferré.
Yeah, well, I knew Maurice well. I knew him from the moment I moved to Miami. You spent a lot of time with him, I guess, over the last couple of years of his life, because I see his influence, and I mean that in a complimentary way. In your book, clearly you see Maurice Ferré as a pivotal figure in the evolution of Miami into a Latin city looking south, you know, and its economics looking to the south and to the Caribbean, not to the north.
Yeah, I mean, we take it for granted now. It's so obvious, right? I mean, you know, you ask anyone about Miami and they'll tell you, yes, Latin influenced city. But why? It was not that way in the 70s. And in fact, Maurice was one of the first people invited to be part of something called the Non-Group, which was an off-the-record hush group of men, and they were all men who sat around, and they were not bad men. They were good men, and they were trying to think, what does Miami need? How can we help Miami? But of course, they were also all white men, with the exception, you know, Maurice was the only Latin. So what happens is Maurice steps away from that when he becomes mayor. Everyone else is trying to recreate Miami as maybe, you know, let's call it 20% New Orleans and let's grab 30% of Atlanta, but what we really want is 50% of New York. And Maurice is like, guys, you're looking at the wrong map. If you look at the map of America, as all these men were Americans, we look like we're stuck in that bottom right-hand corner. You pull that map back to 10,000 feet, and you can see the Caribbean, you can see Latin America, maybe you can even see a little edge of Europe there and Spain sticking out, and Miami looks remarkably central. And Maurice realized we already have an extraordinary infrastructure here. We have the ports, we have the airports, and we have 20 years of Cuban infrastructure that's been building quietly that we can lean on as well. Let's turn this whole economy around and turn south. And if he hadn't done that, beginning in 1973, 1980, which looks and feels like Armageddon at the time, really would have been, it might have destroyed the city. But because he's built such a good economic base, we're in a position where we can survive.
Yeah. I'm going to ask people who are online here, go ahead and post a question, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. Nick, you, in this book, I think eloquently, you're saying that Miami had been a kind of unrecognized city, not a particularly outstanding city within the United States, kind of a backwater in some ways, but it became an international city because people in Latin America, and I guess to a degree in Europe, they understood that Miami, because of its geography, could overcome, you know, the crises of 1980 and move forward. And they came and they bought the condos, they built the condos, they, you know, invested, and we sort of see the result here 40 years later.
Yeah, I mean, luckily, I suppose, investors are a fairly cold-blooded lot. So they're looking at safety, they're looking at rule of law, and they're looking at the future. Now, of course, if you're in Miami in 1980, 81, and the murder rate's 600 people, and there's cocaine spilling out everywhere, and there's this tremendous racial unrest, and the Cubans aren't talking to the whites because they're so upset that Miami's suddenly no longer a bilingual city because of gathering, a small vocal gathering of people who decided Miami shouldn't speak Spanish anymore. You know, there's all, if you're in it, it feels awful. It's a year of utter paranoia. There's a whole new crime group that year, of which Edna Buchanan covers, because arms sales are up 300 or 400%. What you've got is people shooting people in anticipation of them committing a crime. So would-be rapists, would-be burglars, they're just shot before they can get going. So, you know, that's a tremendous effect that year. But of course, if you're outside of Miami, you don't even notice that. You just want your money protected, and you want to make a buck next year or a few years from now. So Miami, it turns out at the end of this crazy year that we've actually had 20% more trade with Latin America than in the year before. So, you know, no one talked about that at the time, but thank God it happened.
You know, here's a line that I loved in the book. I think it's pretty darn good. If 1980 was a diagnostic test for America, Miami was the biopsy. Explain that to us. I think it's a brilliant insight.
Well, I think especially, you know, it was an election campaign, 1980. So Carter wants nothing to do with Miami. So the way to play this was that Miami was suffering from Miami problems. But if you think about it, Mariel Boatlift is a geopolitical issue. This is a Cold War. We are suffering at everyone else's expense because of communist Cuba picking a fight with Jimmy Carter, or seeing a weak spot in Jimmy Carter, put it that way. That's not a Miami issue. Cocaine, it may have seemed like a Miami issue in 1980, but it's only 3 years later that crack is on sale, and in between those years, we've got cocaine spreading in every direction. But by the mid 80s, by the end of the 80s, Americans believed drugs were the #1 problem, more important than nuclear war. I mean, that starts in Miami in 1980. It's not a Miami problem; it's an American problem. And then race.
Right.
Was that really a Miami problem? I think we can now say in 2020, it's very definitely still an American problem. So yes,
absolutely,
we were a biopsy and had more people paid heed to what was going on in Miami rather than trying to sweep us under the carpet back then, maybe would have been a little more successful over these last 4 decades.
Right. All right. I'm looking at some very good questions here, Nick. Here's one. Did you interview anyone from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the book?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if they want to be named. I can't remember if they were anonymous or not. But yes, I went there. I certainly interviewed people around the McDuffie riot, and I certainly interviewed people regarding Operation Greenback. So I would say they were very open about what they later came to see as errors. Not everyone wanted to speak to me. I think certainly there's a man called Hank Adorno who was Janet Reno's, #1. He doesn't like to talk about the McDuffie trial for very obvious reasons. Right. He had some very fine moments in his career. That was not one of them.
Yeah. Well, it was Hank Adorno and George Yoss who were the prosecutors in Tampa. And let me just get you on the record. It seems unbelievable then and still that there was a change of venue that took that case from Miami to a largely, overwhelmingly white community, and then there were no blacks on the jury. They were all excluded. Yeah.
I don't think that would happen today. Obviously the judge was right insofar as saying this trial looks like it could be a time bomb, but obviously if you change the length of the fuse, it doesn't stop the bomb from going off. And that's what you saw. Just because Tampa makes a decision, now we've got to pay the price down in Miami. I think it would have been much better had it stayed in Miami, even if it took another week or 2 to find a jury of your peers. I mean, wouldn't that have been nice?
Yeah, it would have. All right, here is a question from Tal Keenan. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Tal. It says, Michael drew the parallel to the social challenges currently facing the nation with race. Nicholas, is there a prescriptive theme that might come out of the year of dangerous days?
You know what? I think it's a theme that points towards 2020 and 2020's problems, but it's not a prescriptive theme for the future. And I think post 1980, you see this extraordinary change and a passing of power inside Miami between the races. It's basically the end of if you want to call white political rule in Miami and the beginning of the Cuban political rule in Miami. But there hasn't been black political rule in Miami, nor has there been particularly much sharing of that power over the decades. So I think that's a question Miami should certainly be asking itself now. What you did have, which is very important, was the triangulation of races. Race in America has always been described in white and black, but this time it was much more reflective of a population that was at one point almost 33% for everyone. I mean, blacks were a little smaller, which explained a lot of the lack of political power that they had. But there were some positives in that the city could change, it could absorb absurd numbers of immigrants, and it could go on to thrive and fashion an identity first at an international level, then at a domestic level. But that doesn't mean, no, we did not solve America's problems, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right, here's an interesting question from Jorge Damian de la Paz. Jorge asks, can you talk more about the internal dynamics of the non-group? How did Miami's powerful Brahmin leaders reconcile the loss of their power to grassroots activists and others?
Well, of course, the brilliant thing about the non-group is they kept no minutes. There's no records of any kind whatsoever. And I think they were up and running for, was it 8 or 10 years before anyone even caught wind of this. Once people caught wind of it, then they made efforts to address diversity. There were a few Latins in there before that, for sure. You know, I think Maurice Ferré made this excellent, you know, when he once said that the most powerful people in Miami don't believe in democracy. And, you know, that was, I think, a thorn aimed very directly at the non-group. That is this really the right way to run an American city? You have so much power in a room, you can pretty much head whichever way you want to. You have a newspaper that's going to print your editorial, you have the funds to back the ideas, and you know the politicians to push those into law. Is that a democracy? No, it's not. And I think the problem is it became an echo chamber, and I don't really know if the non-group knew that their power was gone before it was gone.
Yeah. I was at the Herald when the Herald finally broke the story about the non-group, and the non-group was really led by then the publisher of night newspapers, Alva Chapman, a wonderful man. I admired him tremendously. He didn't exactly hide what they were doing, but on the other hand, as you say, there were no minutes of their meetings. Who knew what their agenda was? I mean, it was all done behind closed doors. A bunch of very powerful, you know, white men who were making decisions for a community then of over 1 million people.
Yeah, I mean, you can say, you know, these are good men trying to do good things, but not all voices are included in that. There's the very limited number of voices making extremely important decisions. And no, in the end, I don't think that's the right way to run a city. I mean, maybe they would argue differently. I think we all want to believe in the greatness of a benevolent dictatorship, but you know, I think we can probably come up with a better solution.
I think you're right. All right, here's a question from Isabella Maria. She says, Mr. Griffin, what was Mayor Ferré's greatest accomplishment in Miami during 1980? And do you think if Ferré was not mayor, Miami would be a different city today?
Yes, absolutely. I think it would be absolutely a different city. I think there would have been efforts to try and turn Miami to the north. I think, you know, what are we without our Latin flavor? I mean, the interesting thing, I remember talking to the mayor about this, and, you know, in my point of view, I thought, wow, we're so Latin that this is permanent stasis. It's been this way for decades. Why would we ever want to lose our Latin flavor, and isn't it fantastic? And he was like, I'm not sure I agree with that. He's like, in the long run, I believe America always wins, and that people will drift towards what it means to be an American and let go of bits of their other identities, you know, rather than being Colombian American or, you know. So I think that's an important point. What were his big achievements? I think he would have told you that it was turning Miami to the south for sure. I think he would have told you that he also did an extremely important thing in turning Miami's tax base from leaning too heavily on residences to much more on business, because he was a very pro-business man for a progressive man.
Yes, he was. Yeah, he was a kind of a liberal populist on the one hand, but a aristocratic on the other. He was a man of many parts. There's no question. Nick, here is a question from an old friend of mine whom you interviewed, George Knox, who was the Miami city attorney, a brilliant lawyer. And George says, did you find, as to immigration, the drug trade, and the international trade, that blacks were marginalized and irrelevant to how these issues evolved?
Yeah, I mean, there's one, you know, already blacks had been marginalized, and, you know, I think Mayor Ferré was very open in calling Miami a racist city while he was mayor. But as Miami changes and you have this tremendous push towards a different kind of Miami that he's helping drive, there's one key ingredient. If you're not bilingual, you're not really going to take part in this. And that starts to count almost at every single job level, including, you know, service jobs, which had traditionally been Black Miami's jobs. They then become Cuban Miami's jobs, and downtown Miami becomes very Latin American. That used to be a source of employment for a lot of Black Miamians. So were they left out deliberately? No, I don't think so. But the way the city was shifting, did it make their situation more and more precarious? Absolutely. I think you only have to look at Overtown's next door to downtown Miami. Right. And it's always been, you know, now a lot of developers call it the hole in the donut. You know, they're always circling around looking for an opportunity. But where's the progress in Overtown? Miami's moved extraordinarily well in 40 years. But what's happened to Obertown? Look at Liberty City. Where's the progress?
Yeah, Liberty City, Liberty Square is being rebuilt, and those new buildings there, replacing the first housing project in America built in 1937. The new homes are very nice. I mean, there's progress there. I see less progress, I agree, in Overtown. Nick, here's a question from Jay. Jay says, what was the biggest surprise for you when you were researching the book?
Wow. I mean, the biggest fun for me was tracking people down and seeing who wouldn't talk to me. I'll tell you the biggest surprise. I found, well, I'm not going to mention his name, even though I probably should. I tracked down some of the cops who had worked in the homicide department that year, who had been the bad cops, the ones the FBI had realized had been corrupted by cocaine, who were up to all sorts of really bad stuff. They were basically like an army for a relatively small-time cocaine dealer. And I found some of them, and I got hold of one of their numbers, and he didn't want to speak to me at all. The shock to me was that in this country we live in of second chances, he was the head of security for a major American television studio. So, there's always hope.
Yeah, well, many surprises in this community. Nick, here's a question from Beatrice, and she says, some researchers argue that the urban boom of this century in Miami is based on money laundering by Russian mafia. Do you share that point of view?
Wow, I'm afraid that's past 1980. In 1980, we were still, lovely in the middle of a very simple Cold War where you were either on one side or the other. I'm afraid that's beyond my speciality. If that's true, I presume it happened in, starting in the early 90s. But that could be a good topic for a second book.
Yeah. Well, let's all go to Sunny Isles Beach and sit around and drink some coffee over there with some of our Russian friends. This has just been a delightful hour. Just really enjoyed conversation. And let me just hold up my copy. Here it is. The Year of Dangerous Days, Riots, Refugees, and Cocaine in Miami, 1980 by Nicholas Griffin. It is a tremendous read. There is Mitchell Kaplan with his copy. Mitchell, take it away.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nick, for two spectacular. I guess I'm going to have to put this on. Excuse me a sec.
Yeah. Much better.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Nick. It was a great evening. And I want to thank you, Nick, for writing this book. It allows some to discover a history that they never knew, but it also allows those of us who lived through it an insight that we didn't have. So this was really, really a spectacular evening to relive something so many years ago. And thank you, Nick. Thank you, Michael. Have a wonderful, wonderful time. And I look forward to seeing you when we celebrate the paperback in the real world.
In the real world.
Yes.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Mitch.